that makes you feel alright. You know how hard it can be, the way things are going. They're gonna crucify me. Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone.
Greetings, everybody. This is Richard Solomon. Welcome to Taking Care of Business. I am privileged to have Kevin Howlett with me today. Kevin Howlett is an extraordinary author, and I guess I would say he's a sociologist and an archivist. His latest book is called The Beatles. This is the archives at the BBC. These were from 1962 to 1970. It is a masterful work, and I'm very privileged and pleased to have him on the show. Kevin, greetings from New York, and I know you're in Great Britain, so good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
And thanks for being on the show. I'm looking here at your incredible work, and you have a really interesting quote on the back. You say, "The Beatles' musical expertise, humor, and stamina proved irresistible. BBC Radio and TV embraced the group and regularly broadcast them to the nation. When the rest of the world fell under their spell, the Beatles were match fit and ready to seize their moment." That really is one of the most articulate ways of summarizing the Beatles. Could you just talk a little bit about their musical expertise and humor? Because when you see some of the old tapes on TV and how they interacted with the press, they were actually incredibly funny.
They were incredibly funny, and it was not at all usual for a group to be that funny and witty and irreverent in the UK when they started. I think that the key to understanding why they conquered America so quickly, just over 50 years ago now, was that they'd really done all the groundwork beforehand. Because remember that the core of the Beatles had been together a long while before they even had a record contract, John, George and Paul. And they were actually around the same age as groups who'd had hit records for several years, like Cliff Richard and the Shadows were a very famous and popular group in this country. And they're about the same age as the Beatles, yet they'd been having hits for 4 or 5 years before the Beatles broke through. But the Beatles had been obviously paying their dues. They had a great apprenticeship playing at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, playing in clubs of Hamburg, and they were really so proficient musically because they had such a large repertoire. And there was also this indefinable thing about them, the chemistry between the Beatles, and Ringo was the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle that slotted in and made it magical, and he joined fairly late, August 1962. But when you hear these early broadcasts of the Beatles on the BBC, they were so witty and funny at a time when BBC Radio was very formal, very straight-laced, and you just didn't hear that kind of repartee. They were sending each other up. They were sending up the presenters who were hosting the programs they were on. It was so refreshing and exciting for listeners to hear that. And when they got their own radio series so early on called Pop Go the Beatles, every Tuesday evening through the summer of 1963 for 15 weeks, that was such a connection to their fans and potential fans. You know, it was just beguiling for everybody to hear this exciting kind of radio. And it was, you remember an era when it's so different to now, when everything is so ubiquitous. You can click the mouse and get any music you like. Those days, hearing the music that you loved as a teenager was so hard in the UK.
I remember hearing an interview of the Beatles a long time ago, and I can't remember what it was, and it may have been in the 1980s or 70s. And I remember, I don't know if it was John Lennon or George Harrison. It may have been George Harrison. And he said something like they were always trying to find a new sound or explore new sounds. And yet as time went on, it became almost too easy to do so. But what's interesting when you listen to their songs, they really have a wide range of songs. They don't, not to say like something against the band Boston, but I like their music, but their first album was great. And then I think all of their successive albums were tried to be iterations of the first one, whereas the Beatles kept evolving and expanding. In some ways, they made big jumps in their music from what they started. Could you talk about that a little bit too?
Well, I think that's one of the most startling things about the Beatles' legacy. Really, is it's almost like the Beatles are several different groups when you trace their musical development in such a short time too. Remember, because they really were recording together for just a little over 7 years, and they made so much in that time. They were in the early days making 2 albums a year in the UK. They were stretched out to even more in the States when they were meddled with. But they made an enormous amount of work in a short space of time, and every time they released a record, it was radically different to the previous one. I was a child in the 60s. I was 5 years old when Love Me Do was released in Britain in 1962. I had the great advantage of having an older brother, 13 years older than me, in fact. And so rock and roll records from the late 50s had been around me when I was just a toddler, and my mother told stories of me bopping next to the record player while she was doing the ironing when I must have been about 18 months, 2 years old. So I grew up on the Everly Brothers and Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis, Ricky Nelson, all that great stuff. And then my brother brought into the house the Beatles, and I am so fortunate that I lived through the 1960s and the Beatles chronologically, because you do get an understanding of how radical they were right at the beginning and how they remained so. And every time they released a single, I remember the buzz and excitement about that, because you just didn't know what was going to happen, what it was going to sound like. And you may not kind of understand it straight away. I remember Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, that came out in February 67. I just turned 10. And Strawberry Fields Forever, well, I listened to it over and over and over again. I knew it was wonderful and brilliant, but it was so different to anything else that had come before that it took you a while to get into it, but you knew it'd be worth it. It was not actually instant gratification sometimes. You just had to work at it and catch up to where they were. And I think that was true of all the other musicians around them. Once the Beatles had released a new single or new album, they'd set the bar again, and that's what you had to aspire to. And I think ever since, people have had to aspire to that standard too. I talked to the producer Rick Rubin for a series I did on the radio 4 years ago, and it was called The Beatles Here, There and Everywhere. It was broadcast in the States as well as in the UK, and Rick Rubin said, that arc of change within 7 years is so remarkable that in a way, it's not humanly possible. He said, actually, I regard it as proof of God, because it is actually miraculous what they did, in such a short time, and how fast they evolved. Because, it's just not done these days. You can't be so different these days because so much has been done before. But if you think of a group like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, for example, they may make an album every 4 or 5 years, and you listen to the current one and you think about the last one they made, and as you were saying, it just sounds pretty much like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. But when the Beatles release Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, it's unmistakably the Beatles, but boy, is Strawberry Fields Forever so different to what had come before. It's remarkable, really.
What was it like being in Great Britain and being a Beatles fan? Because I have a feeling that in Britain there was more of a connection because of the BBC. There was more access to the Beatles per se than we had here. I think for me, I grew up also in the 60s. And to me, it was almost entirely radio and like a little bit of television, but I'm hearing from you there was all these shows. There were radio shows. There were TV appearances. They appeared how many times on the BBC? Was it like 50?
Well, they did 53 music sessions between 1962 and 65.
Wow.
Where radio programs in which they performed exclusive tracks at the BBC. And they were guests on other programs, interview programs as well. That's just on the radio, and there were TV programs too. But so in a way, yes, we had that access to them in their early days, in that you could hear them doing so many of those songs which weren't on their albums at the time, and have come out on these Live at the BBC albums released in '94 and last year. So there was that side of things, but you have to understand what BBC radio was like in the 60s, because there wasn't a great deal of pop music played on the BBC. So when the Beatles were on these pop programs, it was a great event, because the BBC Light program was one of 3 national networks that were being broadcast in the 60s up to 1967, and that was the only network you might hear a pop record. But pop music of the kind that you and I wanted to hear was severely rationed. The BBC was restricted in the amount of records it could play. It was something called needle time, and it was something to do with the Musicians' Union wanting to restrict gramophone records, as they were called, being played on the radio in order that their musicians would be in work and come into the BBC studios and perform live tracks or be recorded. And so, the silver lining of that was that's why the Beatles did so many live sessions at the BBC, because they couldn't get their records played very often, so they would do anything to come into the BBC and play live. So the very important pop program of the time was Saturday Club, 10 o'clock in the morning till noon, and that was listened to by millions and millions and millions of fans, because that was your weekly way of keeping up to date with what was going on. There would be all the current groups playing live, and it would have an unusually high proportion of records during the show. There would be about 48 items in 2 hours, and there might be 9 records. And
wow.
That was a lot.
Wow.
And so that's why, the Beatles did these live sessions. They knew it was crucial. And the fact that they were given their own radio series, Popco the Beatles, gave them this wonderful exposure, weekly exposure to the nation.
This is Richard Solomon. You are listening to Taking Care of Business on TCBRadio.com, WCWP. And this is our exclusive interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, Beatles historian and archivist. This is Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer.
The fact that they were given their own radio series, Popco the Beatles, gave them this wonderful exposure, weekly exposure to the nation. And it was in a slot that had traditionally been seen to be the teenagers' slot. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon when people had come home from school and they were ready to listen to music with a beat, was how the BBC regarded it. And their first ever broadcast in March '62 had been in that same slot, 5 o'clock, in a program called Teenagers' Turn, and that shows you, how the BBC regarded this music. Now it's turn for you teenagers, so here's a half-hour program. But it would still not really be what teenagers wanted. There'd be some pretty tame material in that. There'd be the Northern Dance Orchestra, which is like a kind of Glenn Miller band. It's a hangover from wartime, really, with a crooner singing some popular ballads. And then you'd get pop groups, beat groups, and the Beatles were one of those that appeared in Here We Go, Teenagers' Turn. So it was radical, really, what they were doing, because, if you remember that they might have followed on Saturday Club some kind of fairly safe, benign ballad singer, and then they would launch into Twist and Shout or Money. It must have sounded just so exciting to people who wanted that kind of music. And you really have to understand that we didn't have anything like, for example, New York radio, top 40 radio of the late 50s and early 60s with those wonderful fast-talking DJs like Cousin Brucey and Dan Ingram, Harry Harrison, all these legendary names. And I listened to air checks from that time. It's just fabulous. B. Mitchell Reed. We don't have anything like that at all. You know, our presenters, and you can hear examples of who we had on the Beatles Live at the BBC albums. There were just a few what were called DJs, but they weren't really like the DJs of New York radio. They were more presenters or announcers, I think they were called at the BBC. And they were, you know, typically probably about 15 years older than the Beatles were. And some of them were trained actors, like the two guys who presented Pop Go the Beatles, Rodney Burke and Lee Peters. One of them was in a radio soap opera at the time. He was doing Pop Go the Beatles. And they would do these corny links, and they sounded very different. You know, we would say that they sounded posh compared to the Beatles because they had well-modulated actorly tones. And you know, even Brian Matthew, who the Beatles really got on with, does sound a bit avuncular compared to the kind of young lot that he was. I mean, their on-air relationship is often kind of like Brian is the schoolmaster and they're the unruly school kids, and they played up to that. You know, it wasn't a genuine reflection of their relationship, I don't think. But on air, it was, come on, get on with it, all that kind of thing. So yeah, as I say, you know, it's still fairly radical to hear that sort of behaviour. You know, we'll get you, Brian Bath Tubes, you know, all that sort of thing that you hear on one of the albums. There's a speech track where they berate Brian Matthew for not playing their request on Saturday Club. You know, he hasn't played our request, has he? No.
There's some fascinating banter that you get once in a while in the recordings between the band members. But when you listen to their archival material from whatever the sources that may be from the BBC archives, what do you learn about the Beatles just from those little, maybe in between song talks or wisecracks or between each other?
There's a lovely speech track on Live at the BBC, the first one from 1994, and there's a bit in a speech bank called Crinksty Night when they're talking to Brian Matthew, and you hear Ringo in the background, and one of the group says, "Can you hear him?" And Brian Matthew says, "Oh, I hope not." And then John shouts out, "You're all right, Ring. We brought you the flowers and the grapes. Oh, I like grapes." You know, it's all very kind of surreal in a way. I mean, they love this comedy program called The Goons in Britain, which was broadcast in the 50s, and every schoolboy would do all the funny voices from it, and very much their humour is influenced by that. It's that sort of schoolboy goonish humour, it would be called, and it's quite surreal. And there's a lovely speech track on Air Live at the BBC Volume 2 when they've recorded a Saturday Club appearance, and they know they're going to be in America in Miami Beach when it's being broadcast, and Brian Matthews is asking them about their forthcoming film, A Hard Day's Night, and you know, they say, well, you know, we'll do our best, but you know, none of us can act, and then Ringo says, "John can act the goat," and I don't know if that's an expression that's known in America,
it's
but
not.
In Britain it means he can play the fool and make people laugh. You know, so John can act the goat, and John says, "Oh, that's Ringo. If I wasn't in America, I'd punch you." And that's so surreal when you think about it. Very funny, and they're just so quick-witted. So, coming back to that original point, that quotation that you read out from the back of the book, yeah, the humour was key. I mean, obviously the music is wonderful and will last forever, I believe. But it's also the personalities within the group, and it was so special to see and hear such a lively, funny group in this era. You know, if you go back to the very early days, you know, pre-international fame, 1963, when they're on the BBC so much, you know, this is the make or break year, and they'll do anything to get exposure. And you know, they're being asked to do just ridiculous things within their schedule. You know, they're doing Pop Go the Beatles, and on 2 occasions they have to record 3 editions in one day at the BBC, which is 18 songs. And they just step up to the mark and do it. And on another occasion, you know, they play live on Saturday Club at, you know, between 10 and 12 in the morning, having played 2 shows in Bristol the night before and travelled through the night through incredibly bad winter weather. It was a terrible winter in early '63 in this country. And they just, they think nothing of it. Yeah, we'll do it. And they do it so proficiently. And if you hear on Live at the BBC Volume 2, the track they played on that particular Saturday Club, 16th of March 1963, they do I'm Talking About You, the Chuck Berry song. It's electric. I mean, what a fantastic version of that track. And it just shows you that they were a terrific live group. I mean, they were just head and shoulders above everybody else in the country at that particular time. And we're so fortunate that because they were on the BBC so much, that we were able to hear them doing so many unusual songs and playing them usually just live. There's maybe in the later BBC sessions they might double track something like a vocal or put hand claps on top of something, but there were no multi-track machines. It was all mono machines, so most of the time they're just playing live straight down onto one mono machine. So it's the group live, but most of these programs are done without an audience, so you're hearing the Beatles live in the studio, well recorded, without the distraction of the screaming that you hear on the concert performances. So it's such a revelation, really, to hear how great they are as a group. And as you mentioned, the variety is incredible. Even then, when they were known as a rhythm and blues rock and roll group, they're still doing some really unusual ballads at the BBC, and that's because they paid their dues. They had an apprenticeship as a live group, and they could go from playing rock and roll in the cavern to playing a sort of cabaret set list in a Liverpool cabaret club, which Paul McCartney says paid more money. So they always like to do that. So that's why you have A Taste of Honey and those kind of ballads in their set.
How much did the Beatles really propel the BBC, and how much did the BBC propel the Beatles? Because it really seems like it was a great symbiotic relationship. Yeah,
I think the BBC, we must congratulate the BBC for being very perceptive in recognizing that this group could, for example, sustain their own radio series, Popco the Beatles, very early on. They'd only released a couple of singles and an LP by then, and yet they have their weekly radio series. So the BBC must be applauded for recognizing that this was an unusual group. And it's clear, because every episode of Popco the Beatles, there was a guest group with the Beatles, and they would talk too, and mostly when they're talking, the atmosphere just sags. It wasn't the case that all pop groups were as witty and intelligent and bright as the Beatles so obviously were. I've listened to Rolling Stones sessions, for example, on radio programs, and they sound remarkably polite. I mean, they sound very bright and intelligent, but they're quite restrained, and they're not as cheeky or as irreverent as the Beatles, which you might imagine because of the mythology of the Stones being the bad boys and the Beatles the good boys. That they would be naughty, but it's actually the Beatles who are naughty, and the Rolling Stones are quite polite and restrained. But so they were unusual. I remember. There's a couple of great Beatleisms that I remember. I remember, and I want to ask you about the whole relationship with the press. But I remember seeing a clip where, or listening to a clip where someone asked George Harrison, "What do you call your haircut?" And he said, "Author." And I think, was it John Lennon who said he wanted to be as famous as Cliff? He goes, "Well, if we're as famous as Cliff in the Shadows, that'll be all right." Yeah, that was George, actually.
Oh, that was George. Okay.
Because in the book, there are transcripts of interviews right through the period, from 1963 interviews right through to 1970, and it's very much the case that in those early interviews you can read that the common theme is, what are you going to do when this is all over? Do you think, how long will you last? Because there was no precedent. Cliff and the Shadows, their first hit was 1958, Move It, a great British rock and roll record, which was a rarity because we couldn't really do rock and roll in this country. It just didn't have the kind of studios and the kind of sound engineers that would understand how to create a rock and roll sound. And the Beatles were part of changing that. But the Cliff and the Shadows by 1963 had sustained a career for 5 years. But to do that, they'd become pretty all-round family entertainer type act, so that they were in very family-friendly films. And Summer Holiday was one, and The Young Ones. And the Beatles although, appreciative of the Shadows and their musicianship, they certainly didn't want to go that route. So it's very interesting when A Hard Day's Night was made. It's very much done as a mock documentary, and it's black and white, although I think that was a budgetary consideration more than anything else. But there's a scene in A Hard Day's Night when John says, hey, why don't we do the show right here? And that's a direct kind of send-up of a Cliff and the Shadows type movie or an Elvis movie, where the songs are, just kind of very contrived the way that they're worked into the script, and they didn't want that at all in A Hard Day's Night. Their studio performance shots or the background, for example, when they're clowning around on a playing field, they do that to the soundtrack of Can't Buy Me Love. So they didn't want to do the usual kind of thing. And I mean, that's true of everything they ever did. They didn't want to do the usual kind of thing. And they were very lucky, and we are very lucky, that they were surrounded by people who allowed them to be themselves. Record producer George Martin, perfect producer for them, encouraged them in all their musical adventures and didn't impose himself in a bad way, didn't insist a song of his would be on the B-side of a record or anything like that, which, other producers were doing at the time. Didn't force them to do songs. Even in the early days, he found a hit song for them, How Do You Do It? And they had a go at it, but they didn't really want to release it as a single. And he allowed them to put out their own song, even though that then became a #1 record for Jerry and the Pacemakers in the UK. It's such a fortuitous event that they met George Martin. And perfect manager, Brian Epstein, who had artistic ambitions and was different to the kind of stereotypical showbiz manager who was just trying to exploit his act for as much money as possible, thinking it would all be over in 12 months. But he had a longer-term vision than that and was a terrific manager for them.
Well, what's interesting is in your book, you actually have the application for an audition by Variety Department, and this is the application by Brian Epstein, who is listed as the manager for the Beatles. And you have, it's incredible. It has here John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Pete Best, and it says the type of voice and range popular. And it says, please give your particulars of your professional career, which you think may be assistance to your application. And it's interesting because this is like truly an application. And of course, the problem with applications, it doesn't really capture your essence. But apparently it must have done enough to get past whoever the gatekeeper was at the time.
Well, they got the invitation to do an audition because of that application, and that was the first managerial act, really, of Brian Epstein. It was to apply to have a BBC audition which would get them on the air, even though they didn't have a record contract at that time. And the application, in the book, there's a file of documents that goes alongside the book, and there's a replica of that application form. And on the back, you see the producer who auditioned them. You see his comments. Peter Pilbeam was the guy who auditioned them for his program, Teenager's Turn. And in his handwriting on the sheet that says, this sheet for BBC use only.
Yes, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, Paul McCartney, no. And John Lennon, yes. So that was his comment on each vocalist. He did allow Paul to sing on the first broadcast. But, his comment is just a classic understatement. An unusual group, not as rocky as most, more country and western with a tendency to play music. And tendency to play music, I love that, because boy, did they prove they had a tendency to play music. But at the time, the beat groups that were around in early 1962, to the ears of BBC producers who were used to more polished, professional-sounding dance bands and crooners, they probably didn't quite understand the rock and roll sound. And there was something about the Beatles that made Peter Pilbeam's ears prick up and think, yes, these boys have got something else going for them. The harmonies and the musicianship made them stand out from other groups, because other popular Liverpool groups didn't get onto his program. They failed their audition. Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Big Three, Billy J. Kramer, all auditioned for this program but didn't make it. And it's very amusing to read that. In fact, that's the most, one of the most exciting things in researching this book was going into the BBC written archives and digging out this paperwork. And I did that for the first time at the end of 1981 when I just joined BBC Radio 1 as a producer. And my older colleagues knew I was a Beatles fanatic, even though I'd been so young in the 60s. And they gave me this project to investigate what songs the Beatles had done on the BBC and what radio programs they were involved in, and put together a special called The Beatles at the Bee, which was broadcast in 1982 on the 20th anniversary of that first session. And that became a worldwide success. It was broadcast in America and made quite a stir, I think, on Memorial Day weekend in 1982. And so it was a dream come true for me to research that. And so over the years, I've gone back to not only the written archives to find out more and more about what was going on and read the incredible documents, the memos and audience research reports, but also to try and track down more of the tapes, which was quite hard because the BBC did not keep one master tape of a Beatles music session from that time.
You have to talk about this because when I heard and read about this, that there was no big time vault you just open up and then you just take all the tapes out, that you actually had to hunt down all the recordings. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it may seem staggering to people now that the Beatles master tapes had not been kept, but you have to put yourself back in the era again. Nobody knew that the Beatles would go on forever and have lasting cultural value. They were just another group, and it is staggering that even when they're internationally famous, the session in 1965, their last session, that wasn't even kept.
This is Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer. Keep listening. This is quite an interview. Richard Solomon. You are listening to a very special interview with Kevin Howlett of the BBC, the archivist and historian for the Beatles, and celebrated author and radio producer.
Some of the material came because the BBC had a department called the Transcription Service, and they would distribute programs on vinyl disc to radio stations around the world. And from the end of 1964, they had realized that British pop music was culturally important to other countries, and so they put together this showcase of British music called Top of the Pops, entirely different to a TV program called Top of the Pops in this country. That this transcription program showcased British talent, and so we have some of the sessions or songs from those sessions, not all the songs, preserved on these vinyl discs from 1964 and 65, but still not complete sessions, which is interesting. So the other material came through various sources. Producers had kept copies. There was a very important producer called Bernie Andrews, who was a maverick producer for Saturday Club, and he'd kept his own copies of some programs featuring the Beatles. The first Top Gear program they did in July '64, Bernie's new program, he kept the whole program and very kindly allowed me to take away that tape and copy it and use tracks from it in a series I did in 1988 called the Beebs Lost Beatles Tapes, and that was 14 half-hour programs of Beatles at the BBC. So over the years I've been patrolling that BBC Beatles territory and trying to restore the archive. And still people contact me and say, I think I have a tape in the attic somewhere of the Beatles that I made, when they were on Saturday Club, and I taped them off the radio. And it's always worth checking out just to see what the quality is and whether there's material on there that we don't have. So it's still an ongoing quest to restore the Beatles archive or to improve the audio quality of stuff we may have that's not quite up to being released commercially. But, you never know. You might find somebody with a good quality tape.
It's interesting that the home recorders may be an important part of the remaining history to be unearthed. What is the challenge in dealing with those kinds of recordings? Because I know, for example, you were involved with the Let It Be Naked project, and I know that what they tried to do is they really tried to bring the sounds to something just to their bare element. and I know they changed the order and sequencing of the music, but if we would actually have been transported in time, and I was actually lucky enough to be in the BBC studios when they were playing, how is that different in terms of actual sound to what I may have heard on the radio and what I may have actually heard on vinyl with the pops and the skips and that kind of thing?
Well, it's interesting actually that you mention the BBC sound, because in the early 60s, when groups were making records, one of the anxieties that record companies had was that if you put too much bass on a record, somebody would buy the record, take it home, and find that their needle was jumping out of the groove because there was too much bass. Because obviously record players were not that sophisticated in the early 60s, and there was a sort of compromise to, in effect, degrade the sound quality of what was on the master tape when you transferred it to disc, in order that you wouldn't have thousands of people coming back with their records saying, this doesn't play on my record player. So that's why some of those early records don't have a great deal of bass on, the original records from, say, 63 and 64. But when they were going in to do a BBC session, that wasn't a consideration. It was just a broadcast. Nobody knew that it was going to be released all those years later on a record. So they have more bass, and that's quite evident if you listen to the two albums that we've released of BBC material. You can hear more bass on lots of the tracks. So that's interesting. But of course, the material that they were playing at the BBC was recorded on quite primitive equipment. I mentioned there were mono tape machines. There were no multi-track tape machines. The mixing desks were fairly primitive and had been around for decades. Kind of, even when I joined the BBC in 1978, there were mixing desks that dated all the way back to the 1940s, and,
wow.
and that was certainly true in the case of the Beatles recording in 1963. But the studio managers, as they were called, what we would describe as sound engineers, were very skillful in changing the sound that was coming into the mixing desk. They didn't have EQ that we have these days on every channel on a desk. They would do all sorts of tricks, like they would sellotape a cigarette packet onto the back of a microphone, and that would change the sound quality as it recorded a particular instrument, and all sorts of things they were up to make the sound more up-to-date. And they were very skillful people, and the young studio managers and some of the Maverick producers, they did a terrific job of recording the Beatles. But when the Beatles records were becoming more sophisticated, I think that's when some frustration probably set in, that they were trying to recreate the sound of a record they'd made at Abbey Road on 4-track, and they were doing it on mono machines at the BBC with hardly any time compared to the amount of time they'd spent at Abbey Road. So that became a frustration for them, and it may have contributed to the fact that they stopped doing sessions. From the last one they recorded was in May 65, went out in June 65, and no more sessions after that. But it also could have been their schedule was so packed as well, and they were traveling all over the world,
Well,
so
in terms of recording, just to keep on this thread, because you have fascinating information. There was, obviously, for people who may not remember, vinyl records had an A side and a B side, and there were time limitations. There's only so much you could pack on an album. But when you're doing live radio, there's really no limitation. Was that something that allowed them to do something that they couldn't really necessarily do in terms of an expressive output to the public? Well,
I think what's interesting is that I keep mentioning Pop Go the Beatles, but it's such an important series. It ran for 15 weeks during the summer of 1963 and really contributed to the escalating popularity of the group. Now, by the time that series ended in September 1963, just 18 Beatles tracks had been released on record. Yet they recorded, for Pop Go the Beatles, 56 songs.
Wow.
So you can see that they were choosing many, many different songs. Some of them, they're rock and roll favorites from the Cavern or the clubs in Hamburg, but many of them experimental tryouts of songs, I think, current songs, contemporary R&B songs. songs that Ringo remembered, they would try out in the lunchtime and then go in the afternoon and record. And some of them, I think, they may just well have only performed it that day and never did again. You know, I think, for example, I think maybe there's a track called I Just Don't Understand, which is an Anne Margaret song, which is a great pop single from that era. And they perform it, and it's a waltz, and John sings it. Wonderful performance on the first Live at the BBC album. I think they probably did it for Pop Go the Beatles and never did that song ever again. Certainly didn't play it live. And so we're really privileged to hear this material, particularly from that series when they did so many cover versions. All the cover versions from the forthcoming With the Beatles album were played well in advance of them recording those songs at EMI for their next album. And it's a fascinating thing to consider, actually, when they had so many cover versions at their fingertips. How did they choose the 6 songs that went on With the Beatles? You know, Beatles for Sale also had 6 cover versions that came out at the end of 1964 in this country. You know, it's just almost random how they picked some of the songs that went on their albums. There's a brilliant BBC session performance of Soldier of Love, an Arthur Alexander song, that could have been brilliant on With the Beatles or Beatles for Sale. Why didn't they put that one on one of the albums? It's just interesting to consider that. You know, why choose the ones they did? And they had so many to choose from. And of course, those cover versions eventually came out on our BBC Live albums, so we can hear them now.
Did anyone ever ask in later interviews?
Well, the thing is, you know, they're so busy doing it that they don't remember those sort of finer details, really. You know, it strikes me listening to interviews, you know, with the Beatles that they often don't have as vivid a recall as a historian has who studied it, you know, because they're just so busy playing all over the place and recording that they don't necessarily recall why Mr. Moonlight was chosen instead of Soldier of Love for Beatles for Sale. You know, it was a decision made pretty instantaneously in the studio, I would imagine. You know, no great consideration, no thought or discussion. Let's do Mr. Moonlight. It could have just as easily been, let's do Soldier of Love.
So when you read the audience research reports, and some of them are in your book, what do you see from that, and how do you look at it now?
Well, I love those audience research reports because it really does put you back in the era, because it's so easy for us in the 21st century to look back 50 years and think, yeah, the Beatles, best group that ever was, everybody loved them. But no. In 1963, if you read the audience research reports, there are always comments that are less than enthusiastic about what the Beatles are doing. One of the reasons is because the BBC had such a monopoly of daytime broadcasting, there was nothing else to listen to. So there'd be a lot of people listening to a program who didn't particularly like this kind of music. So often in the audience research reports, that they would divide up the people reporting and say, you know, people who liked this kind of music gave it this score. People who didn't normally listen to this kind of music gave it that score. But even so, the comments are really classic now, you know, from our perspective of knowing what the Beatles became and how popular they were. But, you know, they're wonderful to read. There's a replica of one for a program called From Us to You.
I'm reading that now, yeah.
Yeah, Monday the 30th of March, 1964, it was broadcast, an Easter Monday. And, you know, there are comments like...
noisy, boring, and a waste of time.
Yeah, that's a good one.
You know, it's amazing to be...
Vastly overrated. Their performance was decidedly amateur, and their entertainment value, nil, said a security guard. But, you know, one of the comments in that, it was a positive one. I love it. It says, a solicitor describing himself as definitely over 20, because remember, anyone over 20 was considered old in those days in regard to pop music, which was seen to be just teenage. He says, how could anyone fail to like them? Their music is so gay and uninhibited, and they themselves are full of joie de vivre. So, good on him.
This is Richard Solomon from Taking Care of Business. Thank you for listening. We'll see you again next week.
Part 2 of this special Beatles edition of Taking Care of Business